Before we begin, take a moment and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it where you are? Tonight's story isn't just about a child who was born different. It's about what happens when the world decides someone has no value, and how Jesus responds when everyone else turns away. If you believe miracles still happen, not always loud, not always visible, but quietly, through love, through forgiveness, through the people the world ignores, stay with us until the end. And if stories of faith, redemption, and unexpected grace speak to your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Heaven walks with us. Now, let me take you to a cold, rain-soaked night in the mountains of Kentucky, where a baby girl took her first breath, and almost no one wanted her to take another. Harlan County, Kentucky, early spring, just after midnight. The rain had been falling for hours, steady and unforgiving, turning the dirt roads of the Appalachian Mountains into thick ribbons of mud. The small trailer at the edge of the hollow glowed faintly from a single kitchen light, flickering every time the wind shook the aluminum walls. Inside, Emily Thompson lay on a narrow bed, drenched in sweat, her hands gripping the worn mattress as another wave of pain tore through her body. She was 19 years old, too young, too poor, and completely unprepared for what was about to change her life forever. The labor had lasted nearly 16 hours. There was no doctor, no hospital room, no steady monitor beeping reassurance. Just a volunteer midwife from town, a bowl of warm water, and prayers whispered under breath every time the power threatened to cut out. When the baby finally arrived, the room fell into an unnatural silence. There was no cry. Babies were supposed to cry. Everyone knew that. It meant life. It meant strength. It meant hope. But this baby girl lay still, her eyes open, unfocused, her tiny chest rising in shallow, uneven breaths. The midwife froze. Emily felt it immediately, that shift in the air, that heaviness that settled into her chest before a single word was spoken. "Why isn't she crying?" Emily whispered, her voice cracking from exhaustion and fear. The midwife gently wiped the baby clean, her hands slower now, more careful. She wrapped the child in a thin blanket and placed her in Emily's arms. "She's breathing," she said softly. "But she's special." Emily looked down at her daughter. The baby's face was smaller than expected, her features softer, different. Her eyes, wide and distant, didn't seem to focus on Emily's face the way babies were supposed to. A cold understanding crept into Emily's heart. "What do you mean, special?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Before the midwife could answer, the trailer door creaked open. Jacob Thompson stepped inside, rain dripping from his jacket onto the worn linoleum floor. He was 22, his hands already rough from coal work and odd jobs, his face hardened by responsibility that came too early. One look at the room and at the midwife's expression told him everything. "What's wrong?" he asked. The midwife hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Your daughter shows signs of Down syndrome," she said. "She may have developmental challenges. She'll need patience, care, love." Jacob didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even look at the baby. Instead, his gaze drifted to the leaking ceiling, where rainwater tapped steadily into a rusted bucket. "How are we supposed to do that?" he muttered. "We can barely feed ourselves." Emily clutched the baby tighter, her arms trembling. From the corner of the room, Jacob's mother, Margaret's future shadow, though no one knew it yet, shook her head slowly. "This is a curse," she said flatly. "God's punishment." "People will talk." The words cut deeper than any knife. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, a life had begun, already labeled a burden. No one kissed the baby's forehead. No one thanked God for her arrival. No one whispered her name with joy. She lay in Emily's arms, silent, unaware that in the very moment she entered the world had already decided she did not belong, but heaven had not. The days after Grace was born moved slowly, like time itself had grown heavy. Emily barely slept. When she did, it was only for minutes at a time, waking to the sound of Grace's uneven breathing or the dull ache in her chest that never quite went away. The baby didn't cry the way other babies did. She made soft, unfamiliar sounds, a low hum that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Emily tried to breastfeed, but Grace struggled to latch. Her tiny hands moved clumsily, fingers curling and uncurling without purpose. Each failed attempt felt like another quiet accusation. Jacob stayed longer at work. When he came home, he avoided the bedroom. He would stand in the doorway, arms crossed, watching from a distance as if the child were something fragile and dangerous, something that might break him if he got too close. "She needs a doctor," Emily said one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "With what money?" Jacob snapped, immediately regretting it. He rubbed his face hard, exhaustion etched into every line. "Emily, we don't even have gas money to get out of this county." Word spread fast in Harlan County. It always did. At the grocery store, conversations stopped when Emily walked in. Eyes lingered too long. Whispers followed her down the narrow aisles. "That's the girl with the baby," someone murmured. "Born wrong. God don't make mistakes, unless he's teaching a lesson." Even at church, the place Emily thought would feel safe, people didn't know what to say. They offered prayers instead of help, pity instead of support. One woman squeezed Emily's hand and said, "God only gives special children to special parents," before quickly stepping away, as if staying too long might make the misfortune contagious. At home, Jacob's mother didn't hide her resentment. "That child will never be normal," she said one morning while washing dishes. "You'll never have peace again. Mark my words." Emily said nothing. She just rocked Grace in silence, watching her daughter's eyes drift past her face, as if she were seeing something no one else could. At night, when the trailer finally grew quiet, Emily would whisper apologies into Grace's blanket. "I'm trying," she said through tears. "I don't know how, but I'm trying." But doubt crept in slowly, like mold growing in dark corners. What if everyone was right? What if love wasn't enough? And what if keeping Grace meant destroying what little life they had left? No one ever said the word out loud at first. It lingered in the room, unspoken, growing heavier each day. The bills stacked up on the counter, notices printed in red ink, past due warnings. Emily stopped answering the phone because she already knew what they would say. Grace was 3 months old when the pediatrician from the free clinic finally gave them a name for what they were facing. "Down syndrome," he said gently. "Early intervention helps. Therapy. Specialists." Jacob stared at the floor. Emily nodded, pretending to understand. "And where would we find those specialists?" Jacob asked. The doctor hesitated. "Lexington, maybe Louisville. Both might as well have been another country." That night, Jacob sat at the small kitchen table long after Emily had gone to bed. The rain tapped against the window again, just like the night Grace was born. "I can't do this," he finally said, not looking at Emily. "I can't watch her suffer. I can't watch us drown." Emily's hands trembled. "She's our daughter." "She's a responsibility we can't carry," he replied quietly. "Not here. Not like this." They talked in circles for weeks. Foster care, CPS, group homes. Every option felt like betrayal dressed up as mercy. And then one night, Jacob's mother spoke the thought that had been circling them both. "There's an old wooden chapel up on Pine Ridge," she said, her voice flat. "People stop there to pray sometimes, leave food, blankets." Emily looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," she continued, "someone else might be better equipped to raise her. Someone with more faith, more means." The room went silent. Emily knew it was wrong. She also knew she didn't see another way out. The night they chose was cold and moonless. Emily dressed Grace in the least worn clothes she owned. She wrapped her in a thick blanket, then hesitated before slipping a small note inside. Her handwriting shook. "Her name is Grace. She was born different. We love her. We just don't know how to care for her. Please forgive us. Jacob wouldn't come. I can't, he said simply. So Emily walked alone. The path to the chapel wound through trees that creaked and groaned in the wind. Every step felt like a betrayal carved into her bones. Inside the chapel, the air smelled of old wood and dust. A single candle burned near the altar. Emily laid Grace down gently, as close to the cross as she could. Grace didn't cry. She just stared up at her mother with wide, searching eyes. "I'm sorry," Emily whispered, pressing her forehead to Grace's. "I don't know how to be what you need." Grace's tiny fingers brushed Emily's cheek. Emily turned away before she could change her mind. As she stepped back into the darkness, she didn't hear a cry behind her, only silence. And in that silence, a child was left behind, while heaven watched closely. Margaret Hill had been widowed for nearly 15 years. In Harlan County, people measured time by what they had lost, not by what they still had. Margaret had lost her husband to a mine collapse when she was 58. Then, one by one, the rest of her world followed, friends moving away, family passing on, the town shrinking until silence became her closest companion. At 73, she lived alone in a small clapboard house tucked against the edge of Pine Ridge. No television, no internet. Just a wooden table, a kettle that whistled every morning, and a Bible so worn its spine no longer held. Every day, without exception, Margaret walked the narrow trail up to the old wooden chapel on the ridge, rain or shine, cold or heat. She said it helped her breathe. That morning the air was sharp with frost. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and mist clung to the trees like a veil. Margaret almost stayed home. Her knees ached worse than usual, and the path was slick. But something inside her stirred, an urgency she couldn't explain. "Just go," she whispered to herself. "You can rest when you get there." The chapel door creaked as she pushed it open. The smell of old wood and candle wax greeted her like an old friend. Margaret knelt slowly, resting her hands on the pew in front of her. She bowed her head and began to pray, not with fancy words, but with the honesty that comes when there's no one left to impress. "Lord," she murmured, "if you still have use for me, I'm here." That was when she heard it. Not a cry, not a sound of distress, just breathing. Margaret froze. Her eyes lifted toward the altar, and that's when she saw the bundle. A small shape wrapped in blankets placed carefully near the base of the cross. Her heart began to race. She stood and approached slowly, afraid of what she might find. As she gently pulled back the edge of the blanket, a pair of wide, unfamiliar eyes met hers. A baby, alive, cold, but alive. "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, dropping to her knees. "Who would leave you here?" The child didn't cry. She didn't flinch. She just stared at Margaret with a calm that didn't belong to someone so small. Margaret gathered the baby into her arms instinctively, pressing her against her chest, trying to warm her with the little heat her body still had. She noticed the baby's features then, the soft curve of her face, the shape of her eyes. Margaret had seen children like this before. Different, people used to say. But Margaret didn't think of that word. She thought of another. Chosen. Tucked inside the blanket, her fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper. She opened it slowly, feeding each word as tears blurred her vision. "Her name is Grace." Margaret's breath caught. "Grace," she repeated softly, as if testing the sound of it. The baby stirred slightly at the sound of her name. Margaret smiled through tears. "Well," she said quietly, "if they left you here, then they left you with God." She stood, cradling Grace carefully, and turned toward the door. There was no hesitation, no debate, no fear, just a certainty that settled deep in her bones. "Come on home," Margaret whispered. "We'll figure it out together." As she stepped out of the chapel, the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees, casting a soft glow over the path ahead. Behind her, the chapel stood silent once more. But something holy had happened there. A child the world had abandoned had been found by someone who never left. Margaret didn't tell anyone she had brought the baby home. Not the neighbors, not the church, not even Pastor James, at least not at first. She carried Grace into her small house as if she were carrying something sacred, something the world might try to take away if it knew too soon. The house was simple. One bedroom, a narrow kitchen, floors that creaked with every step. The heat came from a small wood stove that Margaret fed carefully, one log at a time, counting each piece like a blessing. Grace slept that first morning on a folded quilt that once belonged to Margaret's late husband. The quilt smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Margaret watched the baby breathe, slow, uneven, but steady. "Still here," she whispered. "That's enough for today." She had no baby formula, no crib, no diapers made for a child this small. What she did have was experience. Years of raising children back when people made do with what they had, not what they wished for. She warmed milk gently on the stove, fed Grace a few drops at a time. When the baby struggled to swallow, Margaret didn't rush her. She hummed instead. Old hymns, the kind with simple melodies and words that had carried her through decades of grief. Grace responded, not with smiles or laughter, but with stillness. When Margaret sang, the baby quieted. When Margaret prayed, Grace's breathing softened. It was as if the child recognized something familiar in those moments, something safe. Margaret named her Grace out loud that evening, holding the baby close as the sun dipped behind Pine Ridge. "You already had a name," she said softly, "but now you've got a home." That night Grace woke every hour. Margaret woke with her. Her joints ached. Her eyes burned with exhaustion. More than once, she leaned against the kitchen counter, wondering how a woman her age thought she could do this. And every time the doubt crept in, Grace would make that quiet, humming sound again, low, steady, almost like a prayer. So Margaret kept going. Days turned into weeks. Grace didn't develop the way other babies did. She didn't track faces. She didn't babble. She didn't reach out the way Margaret remembered her own children doing. But she did something else. She listened. When Margaret read from her Bible, Grace grew calm. When the old woman prayed out loud, Grace's tiny fingers would curl, as if responding to words she couldn't yet understand. Margaret noticed that Grace seemed drawn to light. She would turn her head toward the window when sunlight streamed in, toward the lamp when Margaret lit it in the evenings, toward the flickering flame of a candle during prayer. "She sees something," Margaret murmured one afternoon. "I don't know what, but it's there." Money was tight, tighter than it had ever been. Margaret skipped meals without telling anyone. She cut wood longer than her body liked. She mended clothes instead of buying new ones. And when she ran out of what little baby supplies she had, she trusted that tomorrow would bring what tomorrow needed. Sometimes it did. A neighbor left a bag of groceries on the porch without a note. A church donation box mysteriously contained diapers in Grace's size. An envelope with cash appeared one morning. No name attached. Margaret never asked questions. She just said, "Thank you." At night, when Grace finally slept against her chest, Margaret would whisper the same words over and over. "You are not a mistake. You are not a burden. You are wanted." Grace never answered, but she stayed. And in that quiet house on Pine Ridge, with nothing but faith, patience, and love, a child the world had discarded began to grow in ways no one could yet see. Margaret knew it wouldn't stay quiet forever. In a place like Harlan County, nothing ever did. People noticed that the baby first, not because of crying or noise, but because Margaret no longer walked alone. When she went to the post office, there was a bundle against her chest. When she climbed the hill toward the church on Sundays, a small figure rested in her arms, wrapped in blankets. Whispers followed her like a second shadow. "Where'd that baby come from? She's too old to be raising a child. That one don't look right." Margaret heard them. She always had, but she didn't answer. Grace was nearly 2 years old when the town truly began to notice what made her different. She didn't speak. She didn't run with the other children in the churchyard after service. She didn't laugh loudly or chase butterflies. Instead, she sat close to Margaret, rocking gently back and forth, humming softly, her eyes often fixed on something no one else could see. Children were the first to react. They stared openly, pointed, laughed without understanding the cruelty in their voices. "Why does she move like that? Why don't she talk? Is she sick?" One afternoon, outside the small grocery store on Main Street, a boy older than Grace pushed past her roughly. "Move," he said. "You're creepy." Grace stumbled and fell onto the dirt, her hands scraping against the gravel. She didn't cry. She just sat there, blinking, slowly, confused. Margaret was on her feet in an instant. "That's enough," she said, her voice trembling, not with fear, but with something sharper. "You don't push a child who can't defend herself." The boy's mother stepped forward, arms crossed. "She shouldn't be out here if she scares people," the woman said flatly. "My son didn't mean any harm." Margaret lifted Grace into her arms, brushing the dirt from her dress with gentle hands. "She's not the one who needs to be kept inside," Margaret replied quietly. "Fear lives in grown hearts, not hers." The woman scoffed and turned away. That night, Margaret sat alone at her kitchen table long after Grace had fallen asleep. For the first time, doubt pressed heavily against her chest. Had she been selfish? Had she pulled Grace into a world that would only wound her again and again? The next morning, she went to see Pastor James Carter. The small church office smelled of old books and coffee. Pastor James listened carefully as Margaret spoke, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "They stare at her," Margaret said. "They judge her. And one day they'll want her gone." Pastor James leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "People fear what they don't understand," he said gently, "especially when it reminds them of their own weakness." "She's not weak," Margaret replied. "She's different." Pastor James nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he said, "the ones who seem the least capable are the ones who see the most clearly." Margaret looked at him sharply. "You believe that?" He smiled faintly. "I've been a pastor here for 25 years. I've learned not to underestimate who God chooses to speak through." Sunday after Sunday, Grace sat quietly in the pew beside Margaret. While other children fidgeted and whispered, Grace remained still, her eyes fixed on the cross at the front of the church. It unsettled some people. "She just stares," one man muttered. "It's unnatural," another whispered. But Pastor James noticed something else. When Grace was present, the church felt quieter, softer, as if the room itself had slowed down. One morning, as the congregation bowed their heads in prayer, Pastor James opened his eyes briefly. Grace's small hands were folded. Her lips moved silently. She wasn't copying anyone. She was praying. And for the first time, Pastor James felt a shiver run through him, not of fear, but of recognition. The town saw a strange child. Margaret saw a daughter, and somewhere beyond what eyes could measure or minds could explain, something was stirring, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. By late summer, Harlan County was breaking. Not suddenly, but slowly, painfully, the way hope dries up before the land does. Weeks passed without rain, then months. The creek behind the church shrank into a thin ribbon of mud. Crops withered in the fields. Wells ran low. Families began whispering about leaving, packing up what little they had, and searching for work somewhere else. On Sunday mornings, the church was fuller than usual, not because faith had grown stronger, but because desperation had. Pastor James stood at the pulpit one morning, his Bible open, but his words heavy. "We've prayed quietly," he said. "Now we pray together." That afternoon, the town gathered in the open field behind the church. Old men with cracked hands, mothers holding restless children, farmers whose eyes were hollow from watching their land die. Margaret stood at the edge of the crowd, Grace beside her. The girl was nearly 9 now, still small for her age, still silent most days. Her body rocked gently, as it always did when she was overwhelmed. Pastor James raised his hands. "We're here to ask God for rain," he said, "not because we deserve it, but because we need it." The people bowed their heads. Voices rose in broken prayers, some confident, some angry, some barely more than whispers. Grace had been quiet until suddenly she wasn't. Margaret felt her hand tighten. Grace stepped forward. At first, people didn't notice. They were too focused on their own words, their own fear. But then someone whispered, "What's she doing?" Grace moved to the front, stopping just feet from where Pastor James stood. Margaret's heart raced. "Grace," she whispered. "Honey." But Grace didn't look back. She lifted her arms, not clumsily, not awkwardly. She lifted them wide, like a cross. The murmuring stopped. The wind seemed to hold its breath. Grace tilted her face toward the sky, eyes closed, lips trembling, and then, from the throat that had struggled for years to form even simple words, came a sound, not a scream, not a song, something in between, a sound that didn't belong to language. It rose and fell like breath itself, raw and unfiltered, as if something deeper than speech was finally finding a way out. People stared, some stepped back. Pastor James felt his knees weaken. Grace stood that way for what felt like forever, but was likely only a minute or two. When her arms finally fell, she opened her eyes and looked straight at Margaret. Her voice, soft, halting, but unmistakably clear, broke the silence. "Rain," she said. A pause. "Tomorrow." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They didn't even speak at first. Then the murmurs returned, louder this time. "She doesn't know what she's saying. It's just a child. There's not a cloud in the sky." Margaret pulled Grace close, her heart pounding. Pastor James dismissed the gathering quietly, unsure of what else to do. That night the sky was clear. Too clear. Stars burned sharp against the darkness, unmoving, indifferent. Skeptics laughed. "Rain tomorrow?" one man scoffed. "Not a chance." Margaret tucked Grace into bed and sat beside her long after the girl fell asleep. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't understand what you're doing, but I trust you." At 2:47 a.m., thunder shook the hollow. Margaret bolted upright. The windows rattled. The air felt different, charged, alive. Then came the sound no one expected. Rain. Not a drizzle, not a tease. Rain that hammered the roof, rain that soaked the ground, rain that turned dust back into soil. By morning, Harlan County was awake. People stood on porches, faces tilted upward, mouths open in disbelief. The creek swelled. Fields drank deeply. The earth responded like something resurrected. By noon, no one was laughing. By evening, no one was doubting. 3 days it rained. Not enough to flood, just enough to save what could still be saved. And every time someone passed Margaret's house, their eyes drifted toward the small figure sitting quietly by the window. Grace. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't smiling. She was humming. On Sunday, the church overflowed. People didn't whisper now. They stared with something new in their eyes. Reverence, fear, wonder. Pastor James stood before the congregation, his voice unsteady. "We asked you," he said, "and God answered." His gaze found Grace. "And sometimes," he added slowly, "He answers through the ones we least expect." Grace didn't look up. She simply rested her head against Margaret's shoulder, as if to say the miracle was never about her. It was about reminding a broken town that heaven still listens. After the rain, people didn't know what to do with Grace. They had expected celebration, shouts, maybe something spectacular. Instead, she went back to being quiet. No prophecies, no dramatic gestures, no claims of power. On Friday afternoons, Pastor James suggested something simple. If people want to talk, he said to Margaret, let them talk. Not to the town, not to me, to her. So Grace sat on a wooden bench under the old oak tree beside the church. Margaret stayed close, but she didn't interfere. People came hesitantly at first. A man whose farm had nearly failed sat down across from Grace and spoke about debt he couldn't escape. Grace listened, eyes steady, rocking gently. When he finished, she reached out and placed her hand over his knuckles. He left lighter. A woman whose husband had died in a mining accident came next. She cried openly, embarrassed, apologizing for the mess of her words. Grace didn't say anything. She leaned forward and rested her forehead briefly against the woman's arm. The woman sobbed harder, then breathed deeper. Stories like that multiplied. Not miracles that made headlines, miracles that happened in chests, in memories, in places no one else could see. Grace never tried to fix anyone. She just stayed. And that, somehow, was enough. People noticed something else, too. Grace seemed to feel others before they spoke. If someone carried anger, she grew restless. If someone carried grief, she moved closer. If someone carried shame, she waited patiently until it softened. She's like a mirror, one man whispered, but she doesn't judge what she reflects. Margaret watched it all with quiet awe. At night, when the house was still, Margaret would ask gently, "Does it tire you, honey?" Grace didn't answer with words. She simply placed her hand over Margaret's heart, as if to say, "This is where it happens." And that was when the town truly began to change, not because it believed Grace was powerful, but because it began to believe that being present might be sacred. Daniel Brooks didn't believe in miracles. He believed in data, in patterns, in exposure. At 34, he had built a reputation as the journalist who went where faith stories went to die. Healing revivals, false prophets, emotional manipulation. When his editor mentioned a miracle girl in rural Kentucky, Daniel sighed. "Another grief economy," he said. "I'll expose it." He arrived on a Friday afternoon, notebook in hand, eyes sharp. What he expected, money jars, charismatic speeches, crowds being stirred. What he found instead unsettled him. No donations, no banners, no performance. Just a small girl sitting quietly beneath a tree, listening to strangers as if time had stopped for them alone. Margaret noticed him immediately. "You here to write?" she asked. "Investigate for you," Daniel corrected. Grace looked up. Their eyes met. Daniel felt a strange discomfort, as if he'd walked into a room where someone already knew him. He sat down across from her, skeptical professionalism intact. "Hello, Grace," he said evenly. "I'm a reporter." Grace tilted her head, studying him. "People say you're special," he continued. "Why do you think they say that?" Grace didn't answer. Instead, she stood slowly and stepped closer. Before Daniel could react, she placed her hand gently on his chest, right over his heart. The contact lasted no more than a second, but something inside Daniel cracked. It wasn't emotion at first, it was memory. Images rushed in, stories he'd buried, pain he'd cataloged but never felt, faces of people he'd interviewed and forgotten, suffering he'd recorded and walked away from. His throat tightened. Tears came suddenly, violent, humiliating. Daniel covered his face, stunned. I'm sorry," he stammered. "I don't know why." Margaret spoke softly from behind Grace. "She does that," she said. "She doesn't mean to." Daniel stayed longer than planned, not as a journalist, as a man undone. He watched Grace sit with others. He listened. He stopped taking notes. That night, in the small motel outside town, Daniel stared at his blank page. The story he came to write no longer existed. In its place was something else, something terrifying and beautiful. What if the fraud wasn't grace? What if the fraud was the belief that love had to be loud to be real? Daniel closed his notebook, and for the first time in years he prayed, not with words, but with surrender. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Margaret had just finished folding laundry when Pastor James knocked, harder than usual. "They're coming," he said quietly. "Who?" Margaret asked, though she already knew. "Child Protective Services." By the time the CPS vehicle pulled into Pine Ridge, the town already felt different. Word had spread faster than the engine noise climbing the hill. A woman in her mid-30s stepped out of the car, clipboard in hand, posture professional but guarded. She had kind eyes, the kind that had seen too much. "Mrs. Hill," she said, "we've received reports concerning a minor under your care." Grace sat on the porch beside Margaret, rocking gently. "She's not in danger," Margaret said calmly. "She's loved." "That's not what we're here to determine," the woman replied. "We're here to assess whether this environment meets her needs." Inside the house, the inspection was brief and brutal. No specialized equipment, no therapy plans, no legal guardianship papers. "You're 73, the social worker said carefully. "What happens to Grace if something happens to you?" Margaret met her gaze without flinching. "She won't be alone," she said. "Not anymore." The recommendation came quickly: temporary removal, evaluation, institutional placement. When the CPS worker stepped back outside, she didn't expect to see the road blocked. They hadn't planned it. They hadn't organized it. They had simply come. Farmers, shop owners, church members, people who once whispered. They stood shoulder to shoulder. "She stays?" someone said. The social worker hesitated. "You can't interfere with a lawful process." Grace stood then. She walked slowly toward the woman with the clipboard. Margaret reached out instinctively, but stopped herself. Grace placed her hands gently on the woman's arms and looked up. "You scared?" she said softly. The woman froze. Grace tilted her head. "Love here." Something broke. The clipboard lowered. The woman swallowed hard, eyes glistening. "I just want what's best for you," she whispered. Grace smiled. "Best, love." That afternoon, CPS left without Grace. The recommendation was changed. Supervised placement, community oversight. Grace stays. For the first time, the system stepped back and the town stepped forward. Emily Thompson watched the news report alone. She stood in the living room of a house that never felt like home, hands shaking, heart pounding so hard it hurt. There she was, Grace, older, taller, still unmistakably her daughter. Emily collapsed onto the couch. 11 years of silence broke open all at once. She saw Grace's face everywhere, in reflections, in dreams, in guilt that never slept. 2 weeks later, Emily boarded a bus to Harlan County. She didn't tell Jacob. She didn't ask permission. When she arrived at the church, the line was long. People spoke in hushed reverence. "That girl saved my life. She listens like no one else. Her grandmother's a saint." Emily stood at the end, each word cutting deeper. When it was finally her turn, Margaret stood protectively beside Grace. "Yes?" Margaret asked. Emily's voice barely worked. I'm her mother." The crowd stiffened. Margaret moved instantly, stepping between Emily and Grace. "You don't get to come back now," she said, voice shaking with years of restraint. "You left her to die." "I know," Emily sobbed. "I live with that every day. I'm not here to take her. I needed to see her, to say I'm sorry." Grace stood. She walked toward Emily. Margaret reached for her, but Grace gently slipped free. Emily fell to her knees. "I'm sorry," she cried. "I didn't know how to love you." Grace placed her hands on Emily's stomach, the place she once lived. She looked up. "Jesus, forgive," Grace said. A pause. "I forgive." Emily broke. She clung to her daughter, sobbing into Grace's shoulder. Margaret watched, torn between fury and awe. Pastor James stepped forward, voice quiet. "This is holy ground," he said. "Let it be." Grace leaned into Emily, steady and calm. The crowd slowly backed away. That night, Margaret asked softly, "Why did you forgive her so quickly?" Grace thought for a long moment. "Hate, heavy," she said. "Love, light." Margaret nodded, tears falling freely. In that moment she understood. Rain could change a town. Presence could change a heart. But forgiveness could heal generations. Grace's heart had always been fragile. Doctors would later say it was something she was born with, quiet, hidden, waiting. A congenital defect that no one discovered when she was small because there had been no tests, no specialists, no hospitals nearby, and perhaps, in some strange way, it had waited on purpose. Grace was 17 when the pain began. At first it was subtle. Shortness of breath, fatigue that came faster than it should have. Margaret noticed immediately. Mothers always do. "You need to rest, honey," she said one afternoon, as Grace sat beneath the oak tree, her hand pressed lightly against her chest. Grace smiled, the same crooked, gentle smile that had disarmed grief and softened anger for years. "I okay?" she said. But she wasn't. The collapse came during a Friday gathering. Grace stood to greet a woman who had traveled hours to see her, took 2 steps, and fell. The world moved fast after that. Sirens, hospital lights, machines humming in sterile rhythm. The diagnosis came quietly, spoken with the caution doctors use when they know science has limits. "She needs surgery," the cardiologist said. "It's risky, even with intervention. There are no guarantees." Margaret held Grace's hand and nodded. She had lived long enough to know that guarantees were illusions. The night before surgery, Grace was unusually calm. Margaret sat beside the hospital bed, her old hands wrapped around Grace's smaller ones, tracing familiar lines as if memorizing them. "You scared?" Margaret asked softly. Grace shook her head. "I see Jesus," she said. Margaret's breath caught. "What did he say?" Grace closed her eyes for a moment, listening. "He say, still work," she whispered. "Then home." Margaret leaned down, resting her forehead against Grace's. "If he wants you to stay," she said through tears, "I'll be grateful. And if he wants you home, I'll still be grateful." Grace smiled. Surgery lasted 8 hours. Twice her heart stopped. Twice they brought her back. When it was over, Grace didn't wake. Days turned into weeks. The machine said her body was healing. The monitors showed improvement. But Grace stayed still, wrapped in a silence deeper than sleep. Margaret prayed. Emily prayed. Pastor James prayed. The town prayed. They prayed, not loudly, but constantly. Margaret spoke to Grace every day. She told her stories of Pine Ridge, of the chapel, of the day she was found, of every life Grace had touched without ever trying. "You taught them how to love," Margaret whispered. "You taught me how to live again." On the 26th day, as rain tapped gently against the hospital window, Grace's fingers moved. Margaret felt it first. Her eyes widened. "Grace?" she whispered. Slowly, impossibly, Grace's eyes opened. They searched the room and found Margaret. Grace smiled. Margaret laughed and cried at the same time. Doctors rushed in. Nurses gasped. Machines beeped faster. When the breathing tube was removed hours later, Grace spoke, clearer than she ever had before. "I saw Jesus," she said. The room fell silent. "What did he say?" Margaret asked, barely able to breathe. Grace looked peaceful. "He say, you did good." A pause. "He say, now you can rest soon." Grace came home months later, weaker, slower, but luminous. The town welcomed her like a queen, not because she had power, but because she had changed them. She lived 5 more years, 5 years of quiet miracles, 5 years of forgiveness freely given, 5 years of presence that continued to heal. And then one autumn evening, As the leaves turned gold across Pine Ridge, Grace knew. "He call me," she said softly. Margaret lay beside her in the small bed they had always shared. Emily sat on the other side, holding Grace's hand. Pastor James prayed quietly. Outside, the town gathered. Not in panic, not in fear, but in reverence. Grace spoke more that night than she ever had in her life. "Thank you," she said to Margaret. "You choose me." Margaret kissed her forehead. "Thank you for choosing me first," she whispered. Grace turned to Emily. "Past, gone," she said gently. "Now, love." Emily wept. Grace smiled one last time. "I ready?" Her breathing slowed, then stopped. There was no struggle, no fear, only peace. At the exact moment Grace passed, a light rain began to fall. Soft, steady, like a blessing. Grace's funeral was not a farewell. It was a celebration. The church overflowed. People stood outside singing hymns through tears. Stories were told, lives were named, hearts were changed again. Margaret spoke last. She was never weak, she said. She was never broken. The world just didn't know how to listen. Grace was buried on the hill overlooking the chapel where she had once been abandoned. On her headstone, Margaret chose simple words. Grace Thompson, born unwanted, chosen by God, loved without limits. Margaret lived 3 more years. On the morning she died, she was found sitting quietly beneath the oak tree, hands folded, a smile on her face. Those who knew her said she had finally gone home, led by the daughter she had once carried down Pine Ridge. If this story moved you, it's because it carries a truth we often forget. God does not measure worth the way the world does. He does not choose the loud, the strong, or the impressive. He chooses the rejected, the overlooked, the ones we almost leave behind. Grace never preached a sermon. She never wrote a book. She never healed with her hands. She simply stayed. And through her, Jesus changed everything. If you believe love still transforms lives, if you believe no one is disposable in God's eyes, then like this video, share it and stay with us. This is Heaven Walks with Us, where the quiet miracles are still being told.